In today's episode, we'll visit the warm and sandy expanses of the Libyan desert for the back and forth campaigns of 1941 and the controversial performance of the so-called Desert Fox.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Here are again, another week, another podcast. So this time we're moving south and we're looking at what happens in Africa in the early stages of the war. I always ask this question, where do we take it from here? Where do we start? Because as we all know, we can start anywhere. We can take it back in time to I don't know what. And I'm sure we'll find quite a few nice little tangents on the way.
Indeed. I'm going to pick 1911 for our starting point for today. A mere 29 years before the Second World War comes to Libya. Because, of course, it's about Italy, right? The origins of the Second World War in Africa are about empire. They're about the Italian and British empires, both of which have possessions in North Africa. The Italians, they have this dream. Well, not every last Italian, obviously. There are a lot of Italian peasants and workers who are not interested in imperial dreams. They're interested in a better quality of life. But the people making decisions, let's say, in the 1920s and 1930s, and even before, in Italy, they're interested in the idea of empire. And they're late to the game because Italy only kind of unites as a country in the course of the 19th century. So a lot of the quality real estate, let's say in Africa, has already been snapped up by other powers. However, the Italians target Libya in 1911, 1912, which is under Ottoman control. The Ottomans are fairly weak. It's kind of low-hanging fruit. They capture Libya in a brief war. And then after the First World War, they continue their idea of expanding empire. You know, Mussolini talks about recreating the Roman Empire and all this kind of nonsense, but they do conquer Ethiopia in 1936-37, called Abyssinia at the time. Then they invade Greece as well in 1940. They declare war on France. So they're trying to expand in the Mediterranean and North Africa. The British, on the other hand, since the 1880s, they control Egypt, which technically was still Ottoman, but they've controlled it since the 1880s. So you end up having this weird situation when Italy enters the war in 1940, where they have troops in Libya, the British have troops in Egypt, and it's kind of a mirror image of the front on the European continent, where the Italian positions are to the west and the British positions are to the east. It's very important to the British that they hold Egypt because the Suez Canal is there, and that's the big lifeline to India and other parts of the empire where they can draw resources and manpower. So the war in North Africa, on the one hand, it's going to be a lot smaller scale. We're talking, a couple of 100,000 men at this stage, but it's got a strategic element. It's got an ideological Italian empire background as well. And that's perhaps a very basic setting of the stage for what we're going to talk about in a little more detail in this episode, which is some of the fighting that's going to happen there.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the important word here, and that's empire, isn't it? So you've got a clash of empires, you might say. Of course, the British Empire, the emerging or want to be emerging Italian Empire. You've got the Ottoman Empire in here as well. You mentioned them. And this is where you might say where they clash. And even Hitler writes about this in Mein Kampf when you read it. And he says, well, what we should be doing is divide the world. Germany gets the free hand in the east. The British keep the empire, and Italy gets the Mediterranean. So that was, you can see, dividing up the world. But of course it doesn't work, because the moment you clash, for example, over places like Egypt and include, as you already said, the strategic importance of Egypt for the British, it ain't going to work, is it? So you're going to clash somewhere. And that, of course, is exactly what happens. Here's the first tangent of the day, the proper one, because you mentioned 1911. I think that's a fascinating year, and a lot of people don't we look at this because it's 3 years before the outbreak of the First World War, so what could ever happen? Well, a lot happens there because, as you already said, this is where the Italians go to that part of the world and basically take away this, what then becomes a colony from the dying Ottoman Empire. So that's already more or less a corpse, and you basically just take what you want, so to speak. And this is exactly what they do. And why is this important? Why is this interesting? Because this fight between the Italians and the Ottomans in that part of the world is also the first time that an aircraft is used in the history of warfare. So this is the beginning of air warfare, aerial bombing, actually. So there is an Italian lieutenant. He is called Giulio Gavotti, and he actually writes a letter to his father. And he says, well, something like, well, today I'm going to try something new. Today I'm going to drop some bombs on the enemy. So the first military action is actually dropping some bombs on the enemy, and that is in 1911. So I think that's also quite interesting, because we always tend to think that it all starts in the First World War. No, it doesn't. There's a bit happening before that. So that's the very first tangent. We could now go into air war and bombing, but that is a completely different story and a different subject. And we're not talking about this right now. And as you said, it's also, because you said, well, the numbers are much smaller. The numbers are also smaller when you look at the air war. When you compare that to what goes on in Europe, it's also much, much smaller. We can have a look at what happens there and the role of air power in this campaign as well. So a lot to unpack, a lot of things to go for. Now, I've lost my train of thought. I always say it got blown up in the Pripyat marshes. Well, this time it ran out of petrol somewhere on the road to Cairo or something like that.
Train is the key word here, because trains are critical to logistics in general. And logistical limitations is a big part of a determining factor, actually, in the war in North Africa, because geographically, you have a little strip along the coast that's kind of got palm trees and has some water and has some land where you could maybe grow something. That's where all the towns are. That's where the very few roads are, and even fewer railway lines. So you basically have a very, very long coast, but very shallow, usable area. Below that, it's desert, sand dunes, dry depressions, and the odd oasis. So you can send people there, but you just can't sustain very many of them. So you have this long coastal logistical line, and you only have a few ports that are able to sustain any kind of military supply, unloading, loading, ships docking at the piers, all that kind of thing. You have on the far west, you have Tripoli, which is the biggest Italian port. Then you have a couple of others that are pretty key. Obviously, in Egypt, there's Alexandria, which is the big one. But it's ones in the middle that they're going to be fighting over a lot. And Tobruk is a very important port town that becomes sort of a key target for both sides. So this logistical limitation is this geographical logistical limitation is another component. I don't know if that helped you get your train of thought back. We've become a dad jokes podcast about logistical trains.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Just in case anyone was wondering. Sorry, two middle-aged guys doing a podcast about World War II. There's going to be dad jokes. At some point, it took us over 100 episodes, but we reached it.
And it's important, isn't it? You're absolutely right, because in many, many ways, the logistical issue is the one that decides the fighting and also the outcome of this particular campaign, perhaps in a more obvious way than in other theaters of war. Logistics always plays a key role, but here it is so very, very obvious, just because of these very, very long distances that you have to cover and the very bad road network. And as you already said, hardly any railroads. You then have the question of how do you resupply your troops, generally speaking. For the British, in inverted commas, relatively easy, because you can send convoys into Egypt and build up forces there. Even that in itself is not as easy as it sounds, because that's why I said in inverted commas, when you send a convoy, for example, through the Mediterranean, you come under air attack. You then have the question for the Axis powers. How do you cross the Mediterranean? Then you're looking at Malta, and we talked about Malta in a couple of episodes, so we don't need to go there. But this is the strategic importance of Malta as well. So very, very difficult, and this really is the deciding factor and deciding outcome. You might say, even though we have all these daring operations that we look at, and we will look at in this episode here as well, and the very dashing actions by, in particular, Rommel and the Africa Corps. Well, in the end, you might argue, as quite often it is logistics that decide the outcome of the war. When you go, what we're not going to do here because we're concentrating on 41, but when you go to later stage and look at El Alamein and all these things, here's another episode we need to do. You can see this very, very clearly being played out. So some sort of
spoiler alert. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, there we go. So some sort of military genius that, if Rommel had it, again, something we can discuss in more depth, is that enough to win over logistical superiority on the enemy side? Obviously, here it is not. So it's an absolute key factor that plays a huge role. And it's not only tanks, it's not only materiel, it's not only petrol, which you need an awful lot of. It's just simple things like air filters if you have them for the engines. If you don't have air filters, you need more engines because the sand is going to clog up the engines and destroy them. So the life expectancy of an engine comes down quite drastically. None of these vehicles being used there were designed for use in the desert. And of course, the obvious one is water, isn't it? You need a lot of water. You always say, well, you've got the odd place where you can get some water, but apart from that, it's desert. So just thinking about this is also, of course, a huge consideration. And let's face it, the Germans in particular are traditionally quite bad at doing logistics in the Second World War. It's nothing that you do. I think I've said this before. Logistics just isn't sexy. You don't go into logistics if you want to make a career in the German military in the Second World War. What you want to do is to be the 1A, so the 1A, which is now the modern G3, which is the operations officer, standing in front of a big map, big crayon. So, we're going east or south or west or whatever. And that's the cool stuff, planning operations. And then there's some sort of weird logistics that goes on there somewhere. It happens. Logistics just happens because it's uncool. But it is so fundamentally important and crucial. And they're not very good at this.
Skipping ahead slightly here, there's this discussion in 1941 where Rommel is asking for more. He wants more troops, he wants more tanks, and he's talking to Halder, General Franz Halder, at the high command, saying, "Hey, give me more stuff." And Halder says, "Yeah, but how are you going to keep them supplied? You know that we have severe limitations getting the convoys across the Mediterranean, then there's the road limitations." And Rommel says, yeah, that's all your affair, not mine. My job is to send them through the enemy, cut the enemy up to ribbons and stuff. So you can see that sort of attitude, that disconnect. Little bit of a foretaste of what's to come. So shall we get stuck into 1940 very briefly?
Yes, I think we need
to. Because this is the first operation that comes. The Italians invade Egypt in 1940, but they're not that well prepared. They're not particularly bold in this operation. They're tentative. And the Brits, with the forces that they have available, they launch Operation Compass to counterattack the Italians, and it goes well. They push the Italians out of Libya. There are quite a few Australian troops involved on the British side, and they push across the border into Libya, and they capture a place called Bardia, which is also going to see a lot of fighting at this point. So the Italians, they retreat, and you have to hop when you retreat. It's not like you can retreat a few kilometers and make another stand because you don't have any logistical capabilities in the middle of nowhere. So it's almost an all or nothing, where these way stations that you have to go back to the next one then. And so the Italians have to retreat back to Tobruk because there are storehouses there, the port is there, as I mentioned. The Australians and the Brits are able to capture Tobruk in January 1941. So the Italians have to go all the way back to Tripoli. Now we're talking a total Italian retreat of something close to 1,000 kilometers. This is huge, right? And all of this happens at the cost of 500 Allied dead and 5,500 Italian dead, which those are obviously individual human tragedies and for their families and so on. But in the grand scheme of pushing back the enemy 1,000 kilometers or so, that's tiny. Those are tiny numbers. Also, notice the ratio, 11-1. The Brits are wiping the floor with the Italians here. In fact, they capture 130,000 Italian prisoners in this brief campaign because the Italians can't retreat because they don't have enough trucks. So here again, you see the decisive importance of these boring things. Don't have enough trucks. You lose 130,000 men because they can walk as far as they want on this retreat. It's not going to do them any good because of the environment in which they're fighting. So Compass is a cheap and quick and pretty dramatic British success. The Italians don't have enough anti-tank weapons. In any case, you have these British Matilda tanks that are quite heavily armored. The Italians can't do anything with them. So this is quite a substantial British success, but in a secondary theater, let's say.
It's just a very interesting one. It's one of these campaigns that not a lot of people look at, because when you say North Africa, you're immediately thinking Rommel, you're thinking Montgomery, you're thinking Tobruk, you're thinking El Alamein. But this sets the scene, doesn't it? So it's absolutely crucial. It's really important. And you talked about what happened there. So it is, let's use the word astonishing, what happens here. When you look at the Allied forces, just over 30,000, compared to the Italian forces, the casualty figures, you've given all this. And in some ways, it sets the scene for what is to come. In rapid operations, once you've broken through the first defensive line, this blocking position that the Italians had, and then you're basically just trying to outpace the enemy, because once you can cut them off, then this is exactly what and how you do it. And it's also interesting, another slight tangent here, when you look at the commander of particularly the Allied forces, or mainly the British force, that of course a chap called O'Connor. And he's really interesting because, well, he's, as you can see, this is a very, very successful operation. So some people say, you know what, he's one of the rising stars afterwards, even though in the British camp, you also hear these voices, okay, this was a different campaign. So if he'd been fighting somewhere, let's say, in the Germans somewhere else, it would have been very different, because fighting against the Italians at that stage is a little bit different. But nevertheless, he's seen as one of the, you might say, the rising stars, perhaps, is perhaps the right word, because this is also, it's a beacon of light, isn't it? In a period which otherwise is not particularly bright for the UK. So this is a very, very successful operation. And of course, the press makes a lot of it as well. So what happens to him? Well, he is actually he's captured by the Germans in a later stage of the fighting there. And he spends the next, I think it's 2.5 years in a prisoner of war camp in Italy, in a good British fashion, because, well, that goes without saying, in all the films that you've ever seen about British prisoners of war, he forms some sort of breakout club, tries to get away. The first time he just tries to jump the wall, I think, but that's a bit too easy, so he's captured. He then, again, in good, you might say, fashion, they dig a tunnel, gets out. They then decide that they want to walk all the way to Switzerland, because I think there's somewhere in the Florence area. But after about a week, they're captured again. So you can see there's all sorts of stuff happening there. But in the end, after the surrender of the Italians, he's then gets away. There are different stories. Some people say he was released. Some people say he still managed to escape, and then presents himself to Alexander, so the supreme commander of the Allied forces in the Mediterranean. So I think that's just a nice little extra to it when you look at what happens to this particular person. Of course, the Germans are very happy at this particular stage as well to have captured a senior general. I mean, that by German propaganda is also quite. I think there's a German newsreel on that, the Wochenschau, showing him, if I'm not mistaken. I would have to double check, but I think I've seen it, because that's quite an achievement, isn't it, at that particular stage. But that's the next step. So let's rewind. I keep jumping ahead today, don't I, a little bit? So let's rewind.
I started it.
There we go. The Canadians started it. There we are. So the important thing here really is what's the consequence of this? And you already mentioned it. So you've got this operation. So war's declared on the 11th of June, which is also quite interesting, because that's basically when the war in France is over. This is why Italy then declares war, because Mussolini makes the statement in which he says, I think the quote is, I need several 100,000 killed soldiers so I can sit down at the table of peace. I think that's the quote that he uses. So when negotiations come, he can make these claims, but he needs to have fought. Gets a bloody nose in southern France, but then they do whatever they do here in Egypt. So the very first step is that you've got a very, very small British contingent going across the border. It's a tank regiment and a recce element. Then the Italian attack comes in, as you said, and the British counterattack, and that sets the scene. Panic in the Axis headquarters, in particular, of course, in Rome. I think Hitler is, what's the right word, perhaps still reasonably relaxed about this. He doesn't really care about North Africa. That's not on his agenda. He's got other things. He wants to go east. This is what he and all the planning guys are looking at. Whatever happens in the Mediterranean, as long as you can make sure that Britain does not control the entire North African coast, because that would create, as it later does, the soft underbelly, and that creates a strategic dilemma. Apart from that, Hitler is not bothered. He doesn't care whatever the Italians hold or the Germans hold. This whole idea about the Suez Canal and what have you, that I think is wishful thinking dreamt up at a later stage. But he does feel the need to do something to boost the Italians' morale, to bolster their defenses. And of course, that means we now get to a stage, unless we've forgotten something about this particular operation, that now changes things, because we're now going to where everyone wants to go when you talk about North Africa, because that is, let's face it, it's strange enough, not the Italians, even though they're numerically, even in the later stage, they're much stronger, but it is the German contingent. So where are we now? I throw it back into your court.
Well, both sides start to make some adjustments to deal with the crises that they're each facing, right? So you referred to this semi-crisis, even though the crisis is much more serious from the Italian point of view than from the German, that if the Italians were to be thrown out of North Africa, this is a problem for the Axis, right? So Hitler worries that could, if that ever happened, maybe it would destabilize Mussolini's regime. Maybe the Free French, the opposite of them, the Vichy French would be tempted to shift more towards the Allies, because there are French colonies in North Africa as well that are valuable. And Hitler's still toying with the idea of influencing Spain in the Mediterranean to potentially join, to allow Spanish territory to potentially be used against a theoretical offensive against Gibraltar that's kind of in the murky planning, let's say, or at least being considered. So he decides to send some reinforcements to Africa in the form of Rommel and a couple of divisions. And this will later grow into the famous Africa Corps. The British, on their side, before we get too deep into the Rommel stuff, the British, their problems pop up at the other end of the Mediterranean, because the Germans are looking at Greece, right? And they invade Greece in spring 1941. So Churchill and the British theater commander, a guy called Archibald Wavell, he's responsible for North Africa, but also the Middle East, also East Africa. So he's looking at a whole bunch of different potentially problematic areas. So Churchill, his political priority is, we got to help the Greeks. We got to defend them. Where do we have troops in that theater? In Libya. And we've calmed down the situation in Libya. We kicked the Italians out. We weakened them very badly. We're going to remove some of our troops who are experienced. From there, put them in Greece. And Wavell isn't so sure that's the best idea, because he says, look, we're going to risk our best troops in this part of the world in Greece. It's not sure that we have a good chance of success. And those guys know how to fight in the desert. They know how to maintain tanks when the sand is getting into their tracks. They know how to compensate for the heat shimmer that obscures targets through your sights, over the sand. All those kind of things, they're useless in Greece, but we're going to put the troops there anyway. And so there's this tension in the British camp about what do we do? And Churchill gets his way, basically, and they withdraw a bunch of troops from Libya, weakening their position, and send them to Greece. So you have two crises which have the opposite impact in Libya. Powerful but small German forces arrive, and experienced British forces leave. And that leaves the British in a vulnerable position, let's say.
I think that's absolutely right. It's a very, very important point. Again, I think a point that is known, but maybe not everyone always remembers or thinks about when talking about the North African campaign, because everyone is concentrating on the tactical and operational brilliance of Rommel being able to outmaneuver the Allies, particularly, of course, the British here. But there are other underlying factors and reasons. And of course, this really is the crucial one, isn't it? And the interesting thing is, as you mentioned, as you said, is the debates that are being had in the British camp. Where do we need to go? What is it that we need to achieve? What is the strategic value and the strategic position of Britain in that part of the world? What is it that you need to control? And of course, you can argue that the most important thing in that part of the world is not really Greece itself. It is the Suez Canal. Again, we had an episode on Greece where we talked about all of this and why the Brits get involved. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight in retrospect, well, we all know more. And you might say, well, that was a very ill-fated campaign and these troops could have been used in a much, much better way in North Africa. But of course, well, they didn't know that at the time. So, but the debate that you find there is very, very interesting indeed. And then when you bring it down to the operation level from there, that, of course, puts problems and creates problems for the British forces. So you're much, much weaker. You know you're weak. You are overextended now. You have to send all these troops with their equipment. I mean, that, of course, is the important thing as well, isn't it? All the way to Greece. You're in a very, very vulnerable position here. And they know this. But you can't just withdraw because, first of all, it's not really what you do unless you really have to. And secondly, it looks quite bad, doesn't it? You might say from a pure military point of view, well, you know that you've completely overextended yourself, you've culminated, you can't attack any further. In order to preserve your forces, wouldn't it be better to withdraw to a strategically better position? And that means, for example, go back to Tobruk or whatever you think is the important place, perhaps even all the way back to the Egyptian border if you want to do that. But where you start now is, of course, very, very bad from a pure military point of view. But of course, then you've got political realities and pressures coming in as well. Do you really want to surrender all this terrain? Even though it's completely useless, isn't it? It's sand. That's all it is, most of it. It looks bad, particularly in a time where the situation is bad for the Allies anyway. So you probably want to stay and fight there. You can see that the military commanders, even on the Allied side, having quite a few sleepless nights when it came to the strategic and also the operational situation on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's true. And what's interesting about the North African theater is that ground that you capture is useless unless you capture all of it. So it's really an all or nothing, because if you advance as the British did and as the Axis will later do, if you advance halfway or 2/3 of the way across the coast of Libya, but you don't capture the main enemy port, Tripoli for the Axis, and then Egypt, Alexandria, and Suez Canal for the British. If you don't get that far and you have to stop, you're in a terrible position because the enemy's supplies are now right behind them and yours are 1,000 kilometers away. And there's this constant potential pendulum. It's really all or nothing. And as far as the German camp is concerned, they're also having some debates. There are a lot of generals who are not happy that Hitler has decided to send a couple of divisions to Africa. They say, we need those divisions for Barbarossa, which is then coming in June 1941. Why would we divide our forces?
Yeah.
You referred to the culmination point of an offensive. This is an idea from Clausewitz, right? Where you can only sort of an attack will reach its maximum point and then it just runs out of steam at some point. Well, you have a similar problem with where's your Schwerpunkt, as the Germans say. You need to concentrate your forces. That's another Clausewitzian idea. I know, Matthias is getting all excited. So you have these German commanders in Berlin who are basically saying, look, or just outside of Berlin, saying, this is taking away from the main thing we're trying to achieve. But, political reasons to support the Italian ally, plus Hitler liked Rommel. He liked this aggressive reputation. He liked what Rommel had done in France in 1940. So voila, you have troops sent to Africa. In theory, Rommel is under Italian command because politically it would be impossible to do otherwise. The Italians have many times the number of troops. He's supposed to play a role as a reserve to help the Italians and to do some active reconnaissance, let's say. But he essentially says, I really don't care. I'm going to act independently of the Italians, and I'm maybe going to attack a little bit as well and say that that's reconnaissance at first.
That is exactly what he does, and of course that's what he becomes famous for, isn't it? So yeah, that's just the way it works. I mean, the Schwerpunkt, when you talked about this, I think of course that's the fundamental point here. And also, again, it's represented in the numbers that you find. People getting terribly excited about the Afrika Korps, which, by the way, also changed its name later. Of course, again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit to things like Panzerarmee, Panzer Afrika. That's later on. So a corps normally consists of 2 or 3 divisions. That is it. And this is exactly what you get here. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Operation Sonnenblume, Operation Sunflower, which is the arrival of the German troops. But again, when you put this into context, so you've got 2, 3 divisions, German divisions, plus the Italians. But you compare that to the 156 German divisions that launched Barbarossa. So again, you can see where the Schwerpunkt really lies. So I think we need to move away a little bit from this, let's call it obsession with the Afrika Korps and the North African campaign in the English-speaking world, because to the Germans, that wasn't even the secondary theater of war. It's
tertiary.
It's basically not important. It just happens. It's just, as you say, it's just make sure the Italians don't get defeated. What you do find, of course, is later on, again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, we don't go into detail here now, they develop all sorts of great ideas when they see, well, maybe we can get to Alexandria, maybe we can seize the Suez Canal. That was never the plan in the first place. And then we talked about Tunisgrad and all that in a different episode, again, jumping ahead a little bit. By that stage, where they start pumping in more troops, it's too late anyway. It's gone. But that's not 1941. 1941, the situation is fundamentally different. And it's just, as you say, bolster the defenses, keep them there. That is it. Don't get in the way. Don't annoy us down there, southern flank. We are concentrating on what goes on in the east. And that's the only thing that really matters. And Rommel, of course, well, he, as you said, well, he knows that. He's been given the orders. Interesting relationship Rommel has with the Italians for a number of reasons. There's one Italian commander he really respects, and that is the commander of the Ariete tank division, which even when you look at the German reports at that stage where they say, this is the division that fights really well on the Italian side. So if you have to fight together with Italians, that's the division that you want. The equipment is quite bad and poor on the Italian side. It's always been tanks are really, really bad. So Germans say you can open them with a tin opener. That's what they always said. And I think we talked about it a number of times, the combat effectiveness of the Italian army is not where it probably should be. So you can see, even though Rommel, of course, subordinate to the Italians and stands within the Italian chain of command, to be perfectly honest and to be perfectly blunt, he doesn't really care. And none of the Germans care. Because everybody knows that, yes, nominally it's the Italians, but no one would ever take proper orders from an Italian in a situation like this. So that, of course, creates tensions as well. And, of course, you then got an extra interesting little aspect here, which I don't think plays a huge role, but it's just interesting to mention, perhaps, that, of course, Rommel fights in the First World War, and he wins the Blumex, the Pour le Mérite, the highest order of Prussia. That's only awarded to a handful of infantry officers, particularly from the non-nobility. I think it's about 9 or 11. I would have to double-check. He wins one of these, and of course he wins that fight against the Italians in 1917 at Caporetto. So that, of course, formed his view of the Italian army as well. So you can see all sorts of interesting little tension problems that you find. He did have admiration for this one division commander and the Ariete division, and that's what you find all the way through the German sources. But apart from that, I think the view of the Italian soldiers was a little bit different, let's put it that way. And that, of course, then leads to the landing of the German troops. Unless because it's like you wanted to say something.
No, I was ready to jump into the initial offensive in March 1941. But if you want to add a little more background before we get into Rommel's offensive, then by all means.
Just a little bit, because Sonnenblume is quite an interesting one. So you've got these troops being sent from Germany to Italy, and then from Naples to North Africa. You might say, I've just never thought of this, but it's the reverse order of 1943, isn't it? When the Allies land. So you come from North Africa via Sicily, go to Naples. So there we are. Seems to be an obvious way, two-way street. And so they land at Tripoli. And so basically you arrive there. And to begin with, you've got elements of the 5th Light Division, which is later renamed the 21st Division. They're later on then joined by the 15th Panzer Division. And even a little bit later on, in the late summer, you then got the 19th Light Division fighting there. So these are 3 divisions. That's the Africa Corps. So you land these forces there, and it's a very popular story. So most of our listeners might have heard of this one, but it's a good story anyway. So the tanks arrive, the tanks land, the troops land. And Rommel goes there to the harbor, looks at it and says, okay, troops are all here. Brilliant. So we can now do whatever we need to do. But before we do this, of course, you need to have a show of force, because you need to show the world that, yes, we are here. And we are here, and the Brits they're not getting anywhere, because now the Wehrmacht is here and things will change. The slight problem with that is, of course, you've got convoys arriving. And so not the entire fleet, not even the entire division can arrive at the same time, because the harbor just simply isn't big enough. So it's all staggered. And it takes time. And even when you've got one division, I mean, just look at the numbers that you've got there. You look at these hundreds of thousands of Italians that have just been captured. You look at the British forces, even though, as we just said, have been thinned out, still they are there. So you need to basically show people that you've arrived en masse and in force. So you have a parade and down the main street off that harbor where you've just landed, and that's great. And you stand there as Rommel and you take the parade, and then basically the tanks roll into their positions or what have you. And they do that, and the parade goes on and on and on and on, and you get some of these reports being sent back and saying, well, this is impressive. So the Germans now here, and my God, look at the forces they're bringing. And then there is one reporter who, after about an hour or two, kind of scribbles down to his notebook and says, I can see what's happening here, because I've been looking at the numbers of the tanks, and this is the same tank that's been going around 3 or 4 times. I think that's quite good, isn't it? That's quite clever. As long as no one spots that, it looks really impressive. The moment someone does, it looks a bit lame. But so that's what they did.
But that is that's a deception tactic as old as time, right? I just read an account. Now, here's a tangent for us. It doesn't quite go back as far as Frederick the Great. It goes back to the War of 1812 in North America, where one of the native leaders had his warriors go through a gap in the forest outside of an American fort several times to make them think that he had a couple of thousand warriors in order to force them to surrender, or to induce them to surrender, let's say. Two completely different worlds. Native American warriors in 1812 versus German tanks in 1941. And here we have, what's the old saying? The characteristics of war, the character of war can change, but the nature of war does not. Something along those lines.
Very Clausewitzian. There we are. Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good. Yeah. But let's deal with that very briefly. We might return to this, but deception, I think, is one of the key factors that you find in the North African campaign. Probably, you might argue, perhaps not more, but perhaps more obvious than in other theaters, just also because of the terrain, which normally makes it quite difficult to have some sort of deception. So if you've got something that works, it looks even more impressive. So you do have these accounts that the Germans came up with the idea of putting propeller blades or plane engines or whatever huge ventilated type things they had, put them on lorries, drive them through the desert, so everyone would think that was another tank. So when the Brits were counting tanks, because the Germans were always very low on tanks, and the Italians even more, that suddenly, well, the reports, of course, they would get were completely wrong. So there's a lot of that going on, and that, it just plays a role here, doesn't it? It probably goes hand in hand also with this whole idea of the daring and the dashing approach that you find here. So outmaneuvering the enemy, take risk, attack in the flank, all these things play a role. So you might say the modern-day cavalry commander, even though Rommel wasn't a cavalryman, he's a light infantryman by trade and training. But that, I think, is the idea, isn't it? Some people have also linked, which I think is quite interesting, the fighting in the desert to naval warfare. So like tanks and vehicles are like ships driving up, because you don't have anything to really go to. You talked about ports, and yes, they're very important. Ports are also very important for fleets. Apart from that, it's just you're maneuvering within the desert and the sand like ships in the sea, don't you? It's very difficult to control and hold ground, because you don't have a lot of high ground. You have some, for example, the Halfaya Pass further to the east, but again, that's later and different story. But when you just got this flat open terrain, that makes it really difficult. Holding terrain is really not important. It's about other things that are far more important. So that, I think that's quite a nice comparison and analogy.
Yeah, eventually minefields will put a dent in the freedom of movement, let's say, in this theater. But early in the campaigns, like the period we're talking about, 1941, they're not as important as they will become in 1942. So I suggest we jump into the Axis offensive, which begins in March 1941. Rommel, in the back of his mind, maybe has some quite ambitious ideas of throwing the British all the way back into Egypt. But officially, he only gets permission for a limited attack. But, he's going to push the envelope there as till the envelope bursts into 1,000 pieces, let's say. So anyway, the Germans leading the way, along with the Italians, they attack in March, and they have success, right? In total, the Axis outnumber the British forces. We talked about some of the British experienced forces are off in Greece now at this stage, are on their way to Greece. So they're pushing the British back, and they push them back towards Tobruk, which is this key port that the British don't want to give up. In the meantime, the British have reorganized themselves into what's called the Western Desert Force, which is another kind of famous name in North Africa. So they're being pushed back. There's an Indian formation, British Indian formation, that has a pretty difficult rear guard kind of stand at a place called Michili in order to help the British and Australian main force escape. And so credit to the Indians there. They took it right on the nose in order to help the rest of the Allied forces get out. The Australians are the main force trying to hold the port of Tobruk. And the Germans, by the time they arrive at Tobruk, they're like 700 kilometers from their base at Tripoli. You can already see this dynamic starting to happen. But Rommel absolutely wants to take Tobruk. So he orders assaults and assaults and assaults, even though he's at the end of his strength, pretty much. And the Australians are very, very determined in their defense of Tobruk. They even convert captured Italian tanks. They use them as like stationary artillery or anti-tank guns. I think they nicknamed them bush guns or something along those lines. And so the Axis offensive then runs out of energy. And the British and Australians are able to hold Tobruk, even though they've been pushed back a fair distance all along the front. There's more to it, but those are the grand lines, I suppose, and I'll flip it over to you, Matthias.
And these are the grand lines, as you just said. That's exactly what happens. It's all about, it's interesting, isn't it? I always wonder, is it Tobruk or Tobruk? In German, you say Tobruk, and of course, you say Tobruk. I've got no idea. If anyone can enlighten us...
I think it's Tobruk. I could be wrong.
I've got no idea.
My Berber is not great.
Mine either. Say in German, I say Tobruk. In English, I say Tobruk. There we go. I've got no idea. This is, you might say, in some ways, is the prize, isn't it? And as you said, well, the Germans besiege it together with the Italian allies, but they can't seize it. And it's basically it's trench warfare. What you find there. So you've got a number of defensive positions that the Australians, of course, and they dig trenches. You've got German indirect fire coming in. But of course, the problem again is, as you said, it's these hundreds of miles of logistical resupply lines. So you simply do not have the numbers, whether it's in men or material, to really destroy or neutralize the enemy forces in and around Tobruk. To make things even worse for the Axis forces, they are not able to cut off the sea lanes. So during the night, the Royal Navy can send in reinforcements. They can get wounded out. So it's you might say it's an open wound, so to speak, and that makes it really difficult. Rommel knows this, but he's very keen to seize it. But he also realizes that because the Allies are on the run, you can probably go a bit further. So the bulk of the forces is kept in and around Tobruk, besieging that port. But he also sends a force further to the east, but basically into Egypt. And the most important place here is the Halfaya Pass, which controls the entry from Egypt towards Tobruk and vice versa. And the Germans seized that and established a very well-established defensive position, which will later on in the battles that follow will then play a very, very important role, which is a fascinating place to go and have a look at. It's a very tactically interesting as well, the way the Germans fight, the way the British fight. It's linked to tactical and operational ideas and questions of leadership as well. There's all sorts of really interesting stuff you can study there. Should you ever go there and have a look at this? So the Al-Fayha Pass is really quite famous, both for the British and for the Germans, I would say. And this then is the stalemate position that you get. So again, it's the characteristic of this particular type of war. So just like a rubber band, you basically stretch it out and then you hold it there. You've culminated, you've overextended yourself, and you let it flick and swings all the way back again. And the most important thing is, as we've already said, because of this terrain that doesn't really have a lot of very important features, the exception of mainly the ones that we've mentioned now a number of times, it's more about preserving your combat strength. So if you realize that you're coming under a lot of stress and strain, it might be better to withdraw, to shorten your supply lines, because that, of course, is the important thing, and then rebuild your forces and then have another go. That really is the important bit. And also, when you shorten your supply lines, not only does you make it, generally speaking, easier for you to build up the forces, you're also presenting less of a flank to the enemy, particularly if the enemy is quite strong in the air. So that's an issue as well, because you could strafe all these lorries going forward. So we had one of our family members, while he was dispatch rider, he was shot in the head in North Africa by a Spitfire pilot, because that's exactly what you do. You strafe these roads as they're there, and to try to block, to hinder these movements and the reinforcements and resupply coming forward. So that's there we are.
Now that we've sort of got our positions at the end of this Axis offensive of spring 1941, where essentially you have Tobruk still in British and Australian hands, but surrounded, Axis not quite strong enough to capture it. And then you have the front line at this pass just inside Egypt. The question that comes to my mind is, well, how did this come to be? Why is the Axis successful in this offensive? We talked a little bit about, the fact that the British withdraw some of their best troops, so they're a lot weaker in quality and quantity than they had been previously. But I think also there's some degree of tactical measures on the German side that cause a lot of issues for the British. If you think about tanks, and tanks are pretty important in this kind of warfare, as we mentioned, with the open spaces, it's not, again, it's a bit similar to France in 1940. It's not like the individual German tanks are far superior to the British ones. The British have the slower Matildas, but they're very, very heavily armored. They have the cruiser tanks, which have an effective 2-pounder gun. They're pretty decent. The Germans have, Panzer IIs, 3s primarily. They have a few Panzer IVs, but not very many at all. It's always how you use the things. And one thing that the Germans are quite successful at is combining the use of anti-tank guns and tanks. And in that, at this stage of the war, they're better than the British. And so what often happens is it's not the German tanks who are taking out the British tanks. It's the German anti-tank guns. So you'll have tanks that sort of appear, and then the British tanks, oh, there's the enemy, let's go get them. And then the German tanks pull back and the British tanks follow and expose themselves to, say, an 88 millimeter anti-tank gun that's camouflaged or something like that, which can then take out that British tank. Or you'll have the British trying to capture a position. The Germans will defend it with some well-placed anti-tank guns. They cause the British tanks some problems, take some out, cause some casualties. And then the German tanks swing in from the flanks and try to really hit that damaged British force and get a decisive local victory there. These are the kind of things that help the Germans push the British out as well.
Well, it is that, absolutely right. And it's just the ethos, isn't it? The different fighting idea, spirit, whatever you want to call it, the doctrine that they have. And you can see this being played out. So if you're going to have a war of maneuver like this, and you need flexibility on the battlefield, that also means you need to have flexibility in command and control. And it's a broad brush now. And again, we talked about this in several episodes when we talked about different command cultures and structures. the British at that particular stage, regardless of what it says in the doctrine, are not very good at doing these things. They're not very good at having flexibility on the battlefield and having the freedom to act as they see fit. There might be some exceptions. It's all very driven by regimental systems and what have you, but it's a bit of a broad brush now. And so the Germans are fundamentally different in this. And of course, this is even being encouraged by people like by Rommel. And side note, we also need to be careful that we don't always say, well, here's just a figurehead and he decides everything. So you could exchange the figurehead, but that should not change really kind of the ethos, the culture within units and formation. So it's not all about Rommel. It's a deeply ingrained idea that the Germans have at that particular stage. And that you can see being played out time and again. And it's then in particular also when they realize that the British are fighting differently. I think the first time they really realized this is in 1940, the British counterattack that comes in the area of at Arras. But that's a different story. That's a France 1941. But even here they see that British do not have flexibility. They just basically follow their orders. And we mentioned the Al-Faya Pass, which is now held by the Germans. The British launched a number of operations, Operation Brevity. One idea of that is to push the Germans off the heights there. And it's really interesting when you look at the German after-action reports after these engagements. They're quite confused about what the Brits are actually doing. Because we just see these tanks rolling towards us. There doesn't seem to be any understanding of the battle, no reading of the battlefield. And so that's quite confusing. And they then figure out that unlike in the German military, where every tank had a radio on board, you might say that's the big battle winner. In the British military, that's not the case. So all they need to do is, once they figure that one out, they knock out the tank that's got the radio on top, or the big wire sticking out, because that's the radio, and then the others will just basically just advance. And so there's some very interesting accounts, particularly from the Al-Faya Pass, where exactly that happens, where, as you said, the anti-8mm gun, which is of course designed as an anti-aircraft weapon. And it's basically, the Germans use that because also the deserts, they realize that the anti-tank guns that they have, the genuine anti-tank guns, are not strong enough anymore. So they become completely useless. So they call them, for example, the 3.7 centimeter gun becomes known as the door knocker, because that's all you can do is knock on the enemy's armor. You will never penetrate. So they discard them. In the later stage, they get better weapons. But in 1941, we haven't got anything. So what do we have? Oh, it's an 88mm gun. Let's try that. Maybe they can knock out tanks. And of course, it proves extremely successful, becomes probably the biggest tank killer of World War II. And there is a battery of these guns at the Al-Faya Pass, and they do exactly this. And the interesting, as I said, the after-action report from there, absolutely fascinating. German commander there is also fascinating. It's a chap who's a major called the Priest Bush, because before he joined the military, he was actually a Protestant priest. So it's quite interesting, actually. Who then gets captured later in the fighting there. When the fighting's over, he's captured, brought back to Canada, and dies about half a year later of cancer. That's a bit of a sad story. But he was quite famous. So he's a priest who then becomes an officer. He's awarded the Knight's Cross. That's a combination I think you don't find very, very often. So that's quite funny. But that was a bit of a detour again, slight tangent. Only a short one here, to be honest. But this is what it boils down to. It all boils down to this ethos and how you use your troops. What is it that you instill? I think we made an episode on all of this German military thinking. We need to do one on British military thinking, I think, as well at some stage. But this is where you can see this being played out. And so this is what gives particularly the Germans, less the Italians, in this stage, the upper hand.
So I think that's a good note on which to wrap up this episode. We've tried to go through the North African campaign in its earlier months and its earlier stages, from the initial Italian foray into Egypt to the British then defeat of the Italians. Then the Africa Corps arrives with Rommel. The British get distracted by Greece, and the Axis are able to recapture much of the North African, of the Libyan coastline. And so you have a situation by March, April, May 1941, which is basically where we've gotten up to, where you have the Brits and Australians holding out in a besieged Tobruk behind the front line, and you have the front line at this critical pass, Al-Faya Pass, just inside of Egypt. Where things go from there, we had a very brief mention of Operation Brevity. There's another dad joke for you, a brief mention of Operation Brevity, but we will pick up the story with, I think, Operation Brevity in the next episode. So, thank you all for watching and listening. If you would be interested in becoming a supporter of the podcast, we'd be very pleased with that. You can become a supporter and help us do what we do by going to our website at bothsidesofthewire.com. You can even, if you become a supporter, get access to exclusive content. The last piece that I put out was a very interesting Holocaust memoir by a German, Hungarian, Polish Jew. And I talked about his story and why I thought it was interesting and reveals something to us about the experience of Jewish people during the Holocaust, survivors and victims. That's just one example of what's in the War Room. You can free trial the War Room by using the code Deep Dark Woods. So that's it for today, folks, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.